So, hi everyone, Paul Krugman here, uh, bringing back Gabriel Zucman, probably the best guy, and certainly a guy I rely on heavily for thinking about inequality, especially wealth issues. And since I've been writing about that and stealing a lot of Gabriel's research, I thought we should talk again. So, hi, Gabriel.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so you have been writing, and now I've been, cannibalizing it. A lot about wealth concentration. Why don't you tell us about your reasons for focusing on wealth? And I have some further questions.
Basically, because there's a fundamental tension in democratic societies between extreme wealth and the very possibility of a well-functioning democracy. And it's not a new idea.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. All the thinkers of democracy have written about this all the way back to Aristotle more than 2,000 years ago. Um, but there was a period of time after World War II when many people thought that this issue belonged to the past. And it corresponded to a very particular moment in history when extreme wealth had largely disappeared after World War II, after the shocks of the first half of the 20th century. But now, of course, it's making a dramatic comeback. And so we are back to this discussion of how do we deal with this tension? How do we organize the economy and our society to prevent the forms of capture of the political process in particular that are associated with extreme wealth?
Now, there's a question. I've been on the inequality beat for alarmingly long time, since you were a small child, actually. But in the early 90s, let's say, it was all income rather than wealth. And it was kind of, a lot of it was top quintile and maybe top 1%. And now we have, you're telling us that we need to focus on the wealth rather than the income of the top 0.0002%. Um, why that shift? Why wealth rather than income?
Well, it's for two reasons. Number one is a macroeconomic reason, which is that wealth as a whole has been growing much faster than income. So if you look at the ratio of total household wealth to GDP in the US in 1980, it was around 200, 250%. And today we are past 500%. So it means that the total wealth of the country is equivalent to more than 5 years of annual production, 5 years
Right.
of annual GDP. The second reason is that wealth itself has become much more concentrated, and the rise of wealth inequality, especially at the top of the distribution, at the very top, has been massive and has been even faster and stronger than the rise of income inequality. So we all know about the rise of the 1%. The top 1% share
Right.
of total income has increased from about 10% of income in the US in 1980 to about 20% today. But at the top of the wealth distribution for wealth, the increase has been even more, dramatic than that.
At the risk of derailing it slightly, one thing that I myself have gone back and forth on, and certainly I get from comments on things I write, there's a question, comparing wealth of the top 0.001% or whatever. Should we be comparing it to total wealth or to total income? And I know you've used wealth to GDP as and I have some thought, but give me what you've
Yeah,
done it both ways. Which do you and why would you use it? I don't know
I
which is
th-
right, but yeah.
I think both statistics are interesting and capture different aspects of reality. So, if you're interested in wealth inequality, in the concentration of wealth, the most meaningful statistic is to divide the wealth of the super rich by total wealth in the
Right.
economy. So, for instance, if you look at billionaires, roughly the top 0.001% of the population, they own about 7% of total US wealth today. In 1980, they used to own about 1% of total US wealth. So it gives you a sense of the rise in wealth concentration. If you look at the super top, the oligarchs, the 20
Right.
wealthiest families, so it's really a very, very small fraction of the population, top 0.00001%. Their total wealth is 2.2% of total household wealth in the economy.
Yeah.
So I think that if you care about wealth inequality, these are the relevant numbers. Now, it's also interesting to compute another statistic, which is the wealth of those top groups, and in particular the oligarchs, relative to total income or total output in the economy, because it gives you a sense of their influence on the economy. And also because it gives you a sense of how much revenue there is at stake from taxing their wealth. So let me illustrate. If you get back to the 20 wealthiest people in the country, they have about 2.2% of total US wealth, and that's equivalent to about 13% of total US GDP.
Right.
Okay, so now you're dividing a stock, their wealth, by a flow. And what it means is that if they spend their wealth, of course, they're not going to do that in a given year, but imagine that they spent all their wealth in a given year, then they could buy 13% of all the goods and services produced in a given year in the US. So it really gives you a sense of just how big they are relative to the economy as a whole. And also, it gives you a sense of what's at stake with taxing billionaires. Because, of course, the way we think about tax revenue, about government budget, is often in relation to GDP. And so here, what you have with billionaire wealth is that there's a base, a potential tax base, because we are not
Right.
taxing billionaire wealth today, which has been skyrocketing. And that means that's the flip side of the rise of wealth concentration. The positive aspect in all of that is that now there's a lot of tax revenue at stake from potentially taxing the wealth of billionaires.
Yeah. I mean, my version, and I'll run it by you, see if you think I'm being too flip here. I mean, most people have very little wealth, right? The wealth is highly concentrated, and most people have very little. What most people have is income, but the very top has wealth, and in some sense, the wealth to income ratio is telling you how many minions they can buy, how much
Yeah,
influence they can buy in the economy and
exactly.
in politics. Is that kind of what you're saying, or is there something?
Exactly. When I say that expressing their wealth relative to total income
Right.
gives a sense of the influence they have, precisely it means gives you a sense of like how much they can spend on buying media companies, on funding electoral campaigns. Billionaires now account for 19%. They accounted for 19% of
Yeah.
total political spending during the 2024 federal election cycle. They can fund think tanks and foundations and influence the prevailing ideology like that. So it's in that sense that it's really useful, I think, to express their wealth relative to the value of the total income of people in the country.
So again, kind of before we get to the really policy stuff, but why? What's your take on why has total wealth grown faster than income?
So there are different stories, and I think the one that makes most sense to me and that seems most consistent with the data is that there's been a number of policy changes since the 1980s that have favored wealth and capital, broadly speaking. So, for instance, you used to have rent controls for housing in
Right.
many countries. When you lift rent controls, the value of housing wealth tends to go up. Many countries used to have pretty high corporate income tax rates
Yeah.
of almost 50% on average at the world level in the 1980s. Well, when the government takes half of the profits of companies, it capitalizes into stock prices, it reduces the market value of companies. But then when governments slash the corporate tax, and it has declined from about 45, 50% to about 20, 25% today at the global level, well, that again capitalizes into stock prices and now it boosts the market value of companies, of equities. And you've had deregulation in many sectors that has boosted the profitability of corporations. You've had a significant change in the division of value added between labor and capital. You know, the rise of the
Right.
capital share, the decline in the labor share. You know, that means more profits, more income for shareholders. Again, it boosts the value of corporate equity. So, and all of these changes, they don't happen like that, out of nowhere. They are, of course, heavily influenced by policy. So, for instance, changes in factor shares, labor and capital shares, have been partly affected by the decline in union power. When
Right.
unions are stronger, you tend to get a bigger labor share. When unions are weaker, you get a bigger capital share. Also, in the way that we organize international economic relations, globalization. You know, when we organize things without any kind of international tax coordination, or to put it differently, if we organize global economic integration by allowing a total tax competition, no minimum taxes, no minimum tax rates, then capital owners can threaten to outsource production or to shift profits to low tax places. And again, it reinforces the power of capital, hence the value of wealth.
Okay, and I want to come to things on that in a bit, but um, so there has, I mean, the when we again, I've been in this business for a long time, and the decrying inequality business for a long time, and going back maybe 25, 30 years ago, we were saying, oh, there's this huge rise in income inequality, but hasn't really shown up in wealth. And that really started to change. And it's not just that wealth has increased, but as you say, a huge increase in the concentration in a few hands. So what's your story? I mean, I think I know what your story about what drives this, increasing concentration of wealth. But what is the mechanism? What's it all about?
I think there have been different factors at play, so it's not
Right.
just a one issue story. The thing that seems important to emphasize from my perspective is the dramatic changes that have happened with taxation.
Right.
And particularly in the US, because many people have forgotten about that, but the US used to have a, a sharply progressive tax system where capital was heavily taxed, where high incomes were heavily taxed, where large inheritances were heavily taxed. And in fact, probably it used to have the most progressive tax system in the world between the 1930s, the New Deal, and the late 70s. And then during the 1980s, it went all the way into the opposite direction. And perhaps what's most striking is what has happened with the income tax. So when Reagan enters the White House in 1981, the top marginal income tax rate in the US is 70%. At the time, it's the highest top marginal tax rate of all industrialized countries in the world. And then in 1986, you have the big tax reform, the Reagan tax reform, that slashes this top rate to 28%, which at the time was the lowest tax
Right.
rate among industrialized countries. So it's a really big change in just 5 years. And you've had that for the income tax, but also for the estate tax, but also the corporate tax rate used to be 50% after World War II. After 2018, the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's been reduced to 21%. And so all of these really big changes, all going in the same direction, have had a massive effect on how much, on two things. So first of all, on the incentives for very wealthy people to try to earn super high incomes. So when the top marginal income tax rate was close to 100%,
Right.
more than 90% in the 1940s, 1950s, there was just no incentive to try to earn a ton of money because you knew that past some point, almost any extra dollar would go to the IRS. So why bother? Why try to bargain a super high compensation as a CEO? It was just pointless. Now, when the top marginal income tax rate is 28%, now it becomes really profitable to try to earn super high incomes, right? Because you get to keep most of the money for yourself. So there is this incentive effect. And there's, of course, the pure mechanical effect, which is that with lower tax rates, you have more disposable income when you're very rich that you can save and use to grow your wealth. And that's why I think those changes to taxation, which have been particularly powerful in the US, have played a very important story in the particularly fast rise of US inequality.
Now, when you talk about incentives, if I were a right winger, I'd say, well, the old system, so it discouraged people from innovating, being job creators, and all that. And I think that's not what you mean, right?
Well, then it becomes an empirical question, right? So
Right.
so in principle, it could be true. You could say, well, when people face those super high top marginal income tax rates, it discouraged people from innovating, from launching businesses. But then you look at the data and you realize that in those decades after World War II, GDP growth was higher, in fact, than it's been since the 1980s. Investment rates were no lower. In fact, they were higher. US capitalism, broadly speaking, seemed to work okay at that period of time, in that period of time. So, of course, you don't know the counterfactual. You don't know what would have happened if the tax rates had been much lower at the top in those decades. But what you can know as a fact is that this quasi-confiscatory rates on high incomes, and we're talking about rates that apply to only super high incomes of several millions
Right.
of today's dollars, that just didn't kill innovation and growth and capitalism. And you have to think about who you're discouraging, what type of behavior you're discouraging when you tax very high incomes at very high rates. You could say, okay, perhaps it's going to discourage innovation, but are scientists or innovators really motivated by the extra income they're going to be able to make above $5 million in income? Perhaps not. You're also discouraging people who want just to capture rents, who want to create private universities that sell fake diplomas, for instance, or want to exploit patents and squeeze as much money as possible from consumers or patients or sick people and so on. So, there's also always in the economy, you have people who are motivated by innovating, creating knowledge and, broadly speaking, undertaking activities that are positive sum for the economy as a whole. And there's also people who are motivated by rent extraction, by different activities that are inherently zero sum or even negative sum. And certainly, when you have 90% top marginal income tax rates, you're discouraging this type of zero sum rent extraction, which is the plausible reason why this policy was so effective, at least relatively effective in the post-war decades.
Okay, I mean it's the classic one from my um, angle has been that corporate CEOs have always basically set their own salaries, but in 1959, extracting a salary that was 500 times that of your average worker just made everybody mad at you, and you didn't get to keep much of it anyway. And nowadays you do. So that's yeah. Looks as if, and certainly from your work and those of us who pick up on it, that we have had this process of since the late '70s of this concentration, this oligarchy rising in our society, and that taxes have a lot to do with it. So the question is, what kind of remedies? And you've been. I know that we'll get to wealth taxes in a minute, but we had a kind of a workable recipe, which was high corporate taxes, high estate taxes, high top marginal rate. Is there a reason why we can't just reconstitute that regime, or why we shouldn't? Either a possibility or desirability.
I think we could do it, and it would make sense, but also probably it wouldn't be enough. So first of all, one of the outcome of the first Gilded Age at the beginning of the 20th century was the creation of the progressive income tax in 1913, the progressive estate tax in 1916. So we
Right.
instituted taxes to prevent, to curb the rise of concentration that was observed at the time and that many people were worried about. It made a big difference, but also there was and has always been a kind of fundamental limitation, I think, with this historical experiment, which is that when you're extremely wealthy, and think about
Right.
billionaires, it's in fact very easy to own a lot of wealth without having to report any significant amount of income. And so it's in fact relatively easy to avoid the income tax. And we kind of knew about that from various anecdotes and case studies. So, for instance, a few years ago, you had revelations by ProPublica on the taxes paid by US billionaires, and you saw people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk in some years reporting very little income, paying very little income tax. There's even one year when Bezos says, look, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim the child tax credit, and he receives the child tax credit.
Right.
So we kind of knew about these limitations of the income tax, but it's only relatively recently that we've come to understand that this is a structural feature of income taxation in the US and globally, a structural feature that the super rich have not yet entered into the system. The income tax is just not the right instrument for them to tax them. And so that's why, in addition to the income tax, you need some kind of tax based on wealth. Because for the very rich, it's easy to manipulate income to pretend they have no income. So, for instance, Bezos, as CEO of Amazon, didn't pay himself a wage. He instructed Amazon not to distribute dividends. He didn't sell shares, and so he didn't realize capital gains. And so his taxable income was really low. There's no tax evasion there. It's all perfectly legal. But of course, his ability to pay taxes as one of the world's richest men is, of course, extremely high. And so that's why for people like him, the right tax is based not on income, but on wealth, which is much harder to manipulate than income. And that was partly one of the reasons for having a estate tax, which is a tax on wealth, but it's not enough because the estate tax is just a one-time tax at the time of death. And so you can be in a situation where the wealthiest people in the country, year after year, pay no or almost no income tax. And it's only when they die that when the estate tax was still functional that we try to make them pay a little bit of tax. That's the limitation of the US experiment with progressive taxation, which is that it didn't never really tried to make the ultra wealthy pay personally on an annual basis. And I think that this limitation that we need to overcome in the 21st century, and basically that has to involve some kind of annual taxation based on wealth.
So my want to talk about corporate taxes in this. Well, let's talk about corporate taxes. So we used to collect a substantial amount of corporate taxes, which I mean, there's a lot of dispute about exactly who pays them, but your position, as I understand it, is that basically they fall on stockholders. Um, is is there why did we retreat so much on corporate taxes, and could that be reconstituted? Should it be? Both could and should it be reconstituted?
So first of all, yes, you're right that the corporate tax used to be a big source of tax revenue for the US. It peaked in the early 1950s at something like 6-7% of US GDP in tax
Right.
revenue just from the corporate tax.
Right.
That was with a nominal tax rate for the federal corporate tax that was slightly above 50%, but the effective rate was also 50%. It meant that out of any dollar of profit made, 50 cents went to the government. And today we are down to about 1.5% or so of GDP in tax revenue, 1.52% from the corporate tax. So it's a big decline. The reason for this decline has to do with first the view that the corporate tax is particularly harmful, that if you tax corporate
Right.
profits, then it's going to reduce corporate investment, which is going to to translate into a decline in the capital stock. And then workers are going to be less productive because capital is
Right.
good, it complements labor, and so eventually it reduces wages. And so it's bad for ordinary workers. That's the standard story, which frankly doesn't have a lot of empirical support for it. But why not? You know, as an intellectual story, it makes some sense in principle. The other reason, which has been even more powerful in practice, is international tax competition. Is the
Right.
idea that we cannot tax corporations at higher rates because otherwise they move to other countries, and that there is this kind of law of nature. The race to the bottom with corporate taxation is something we just have to accept as a law of nature, like gravity.
Right.
And that also is wrong because, of course, it's not a law of nature. It's a choice that we make collectively to accept international tax competition or to fight it and to curb it. So I think what this all means is that, of course, we could revert to higher corporate tax rates. Uh, that's definitely something that the US or, in fact, any country can do. But what I want to say is that also it wouldn't be enough because the corporate tax is just a flat tax on corporate profits.
Right.
So someone who owns just one share in Amazon, let's say, indirectly is going to pay the same tax rate through the corporate tax as Jeff Bezos, who owns 10% of Amazon. So it's not progressive, and so that's why it's structurally limited.
Okay. In the abstract, if our concern is great wealth, and we're looking for some way to limit that and also raise some revenue, but I think in many ways the social, I've come back to that, but the social political implications are in a way even more central than the revenue. But there's remarkably little experience with wealth taxes, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of evidence, and a lot of people saying that they're unworkable, and a lot of people citing what they claim to have been the history of France. So why don't you talk to me about history of wealth taxation?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. never had an annual progressive wealth tax,
Right.
at least at the federal level. There's in fact a pretty long history of wealth taxation at the state level in the 19th century,
Oh,
with so-called generalized property taxes that were taxes not just on real estate and land, but also on financial assets, typically at flat rates, so not rising with wealth. Um, but there's a long tradition in the US that's been largely forgotten. Um, but the more relevant history is the European experience with progressive wealth taxation. Many European countries used to have progressive wealth taxes. And I agree that the track record is not good. Is by and large, they were not big successes. But of course, there are two ways to look at that experience. You can say, well, some countries tried wealth taxes, it didn't work very well, hence it will never work. End of
right.
story. Or you can try to study this experience and try to understand what were the problems and what lessons can be drawn and whether the issues can be overcome. And this is what I've been doing with many others in my work. And the conclusion I've reached is that yes, they had issues, these European wealth taxes, but the issues can be fixed. So the biggest issue is that those wealth taxes didn't even attempt to try to tax billionaires. So look at France, for instance. So France is really a striking illustration. The French wealth tax was created in 1981 when socialist president comes
Right.
in power and he has an absolute majority in parliament, and so he creates a wealth tax. But immediately he says, okay, we are going to exempt from the wealth tax people who own more than 25% of the shares of a company. Okay, so if you are a big shareholder in a company, no matter whether it's listed on the stock market or not, if you own a ton of stock, that's going to be removed from the base of the wealth tax. This will be tax-free. But the wealth of billionaires is precisely that. It's owning a lot of shares in a company. So what France did in 1981 was like if the US today created a wealth tax and said we're going to exempt Warren Buffett from the wealth tax, or we're going to exempt Elon Musk from the wealth tax because they have so many shares in their businesses. It really makes
I,
little sense. And the consequence of that, just to finish on this, is that the effective wealth tax rate for French billionaires in 2016, on the eve of the abolition of the wealth tax, was just 0.005% of wealth. They didn't pay it. And it's not because they illegally hid assets. No, it's because they were legally exempted from the wealth tax.
why did Mitterrand do that? Do you know? It's
I think the story is, well, that's kind of the proximate cause. The way the story is often told is that some of the top billionaires complained and went see him, and they said, "We're going to move. We're going to move to Switzerland if you do that." And so that's how they got that exemption. But the deeper, I think, explanation is that there was no real commitment on the part of Mitterrand or the Socialist Party for having a tax on billionaire wealth, partly because they thought it would be impossible, that we had to accept international tax competition as a kind of given, that France would be powerless to do anything about that. Partly because it was never a big priority for them. They bet on other policies to transform society that didn't involve progressive taxation, but that involved, things like the nationalization of some companies or, labor market regulations. But progressive taxation was not part of their kind of ideology, so to speak. They were not very committed to that. And also, I think in the 1980s, you could make the case that the government revenue at stake was just not very important. So it
right.
was not worth fighting for this. I think that was their view. And, it was perhaps you could make that argument in 1980s, 1990s, but today, it's impossible. Look at what has happened to the curve. The wealth of billionaires has skyrocketed. So now it becomes really important to include them in the base. So that was the main problem. The billionaires were legally exempt. The other big problem is that, and that's related, of course, to the first one, is that those European countries, they never tried to do anything to fight the risk of out-migration by the super rich. They just thought that, okay, we are powerless. If they want to leave, what can we do? And that's just not true. For instance, in the US, there is citizenship-based taxation, meaning if you are a US national, you have to pay taxes in the US no matter where you live. And so you can move to Monaco or Switzerland if you want, you still have to pay federal taxes. So France, Germany could have done that. They could have done variation over that idea. But the big blind spot of the social democratic experiment in Western Europe has been, in my view, this inability to confront the forces of international competition and international tax competition in particular.
So that's it. Can you want to enlarge on that? Because I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, these social democratic governments never invested intellectually in trying to organize international economic relations and make those consistent with their ambitions for democratic transformation. Or to put it differently, the social democratic project, was always thought of as a purely domestic endeavor. And when they realized that, okay, there was competition from other countries, tax competition in particular, their reaction was not, what can we do about that? How can we rewrite the rules of global commerce? How can we forge international agreements? Or how can we design unilateral policies to protect ourselves from those forces? Their reaction was not that. Their reaction was, oh, there's international competition. We cannot do anything about that. We just have to adapt. And so we have to embrace the race to the bottom with capital taxation. And that's how in fact, it's socialist governments or labor governments in the UK or SPD in Germany that have slashed the corporate tax rate, that have, like in Scandinavia, moved from a comprehensive income tax where capital and labor are taxed the same to so-called dual income tax systems where capital income is taxed at lower rates, flat rates, than labor income. Always for the same reason, which they never tried to think about how to make social democracy compatible with a globally integrated economy.
That's a more cosmic. That's a good story. Although, am I wrong? I think that the EU has a kind of minimum VAT rule, right? That
yes,
that countries so the tax that
VAT.
falls on working people, you cannot make it too low, but the tax that falls on billionaires.
Yeah, exactly. The only form of tax harmonization, that's a very good point, that you have in the EU is on VAT. So when it comes to taxing consumers, the middle class, the poor, all of a sudden we can craft common rules. But when it comes to taxing companies or the rich, what can we do? Nothing.
Right. So if Ireland goes and poaches corporations, although I think it's mostly U.S. corporations there, but anyway, Ireland can do that, but they can't offer shoppers bargains.
Yeah,
it's a pretty
wild. It's a very weird. It's a very particular worldview, but that's been central, in fact, in the how European construction has proceeded so far. And I think if you want to rationalize this view, I think deep down there is the kind of the idea that it's not just that international tax competition is a law of nature, but it's also that it's a good thing. Frankly, that's
Yeah.
it's something we should embrace because those welfare states in Western Europe, they're too big, and they need some kind of external outside pressure to force governments to be more efficient, starve the beast a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think many people, even left of center people, at one point they embraced this idea that we should welcome is going to make us more efficient. We should welcome international tax competition. Which why not? You can make that case, but it I think has two problems. One is that it's a pretty undemocratic way
Yeah.
to decide things. And it assumes that voters are going to structurally choose policies that overtax capital or the rich, and hence the need for constitutional constraints or the need for external forces. And of course, the other problem is that international tax competition, the way that it has unfolded, has fueled the rise of inequality, because the main winners from this are multinational companies and their owners, or people who derive most of their income from capital income, the
Right.
wealthy, and so on.
Okay. And that's interesting. I mean, it's a good question about how what we think of as sort of Reaganite or ideas, but may have actually had a lot of impact even in Europe.
They did, even though it was never formulated as explicitly. But I think this ideology was very influential, in fact, in Europe.
So you've been pushing for, in fact, some kind of global accord to start to curb it basically make it possible to do more wealth taxation. You want to just describe for me? I've been rereading your G20 paper on all of this, but I think maybe you can tell me about what's the state of the idea. I don't think this is anything likely to happen anytime soon, but what's the state of the idea?
It will happen, but patience.
Yeah, patience.
I think
Well,
the beginning, the beginning of all of this is in 2021. There was an agreement
right,
among 130 countries for having a minimum tax of 15% on the profits of big multinational companies.
right,
And frankly, very few people had seen that coming, because the prevailing view was, it's impossible to get an agreement like that. The small countries, they benefit so much, like Ireland, from international tax competition,
right.
that it's just utopian. But it happened in 2021, and then in 2024, Brazil had the presidency of the G20, and they wanted to put new ideas on the agenda. And they asked me what I thought, and what I told them is, I said, look, I think we should do for billionaires what we've been able to do for multinational firms. So
Right.
let's try to have an agreement on a minimum annual amount of tax owed by billionaires. And they commissioned a report from me, and some progress was made at the G20. But then, of course, then Trump was reelected, and so nothing can happen at the moment at the G20 level. But what's really interesting is what is happening at the national and, in fact, sub national level these days, because right after the G20, the Brazilian G20 in 2024, first in France, the French National Assembly adopted the minimum tax on billionaire wealth that I had proposed. So it's a tax of 2% on the wealth of people with more than $100 million or euros in net wealth. And it's a minimum tax, which means that if you already pay in income tax the equivalent of 2% of your wealth or more, you have nothing more to pay. But if you
Right.
pay less than that, you have to pay the difference to reach the 2% minimum. So it's the fairest and the most targeted tax that you can imagine, because it's just on the ultra wealthy. But not only that, on those among the ultra wealthy that avoid taxation today. So France voted that. It was then blocked by the very conservative Senate. But there is the beginning of an international movement in that direction. So you've had a bill crafted under French legislation that's been introduced in Belgium, perhaps soon in the Netherlands, in Spain. At the moment in the UK, they're talking a lot about that with the new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. And then, of course, most important in my view, is what is happening in California
Right.
with Prop 40, the California billionaire tax, which is going to be on the ballot in November. And this would be a one-time tax of 5% on the wealth of California's billionaires. And frankly, it's very important for California, for funding healthcare, Medicaid in particular, but it's even more important for the US and in fact for the world as a whole. Because if California passes Prop 40, the California billionaire tax in November, I think this will be the beginning for real of the US and international movement to tax the wealth of the super rich.
And this is a one-time tax, and it's retroactive, right? It's based on your wealth like last year, not
Yeah, so exactly. So it has several characteristics. It's one time and not annual, and it's only for billionaires,
right.
not for you and I. And it's just those, and it's on billionaires, and it's on those billionaires who were resident of California as of January 1st of 2026.
Right.
So it's too late to avoid the tax. Meaning, if you move out of California now, if you were living in California at the beginning of this year, you would still have to pay the tax. So in that sense, there's a small retroactivity here. And these two characteristics combined, the fact that it's one time and based on being a resident January 1st of 2026, means that it's nearly impossible for any billionaire to avoid the tax by moving to another state. And so it also means that if it passes, it's bound to generate a lot of tax revenue. The arithmetic is quite simple. The billionaires of California, they have about $2 trillion in wealth. So if you tax them at 5%, you get 100 billions in tax revenue. Another kind of illustration of how big the billionaire wealth tax base has become, which I think is quite striking, is the following. If you look at all the income of Californian people as reported in their tax return, AGI, adjusted gross income for California as a whole, it's the same number as the wealth of California's billionaires, 250 people. So, their wealth is 100% of California's AGI. Meaning if you have a 5% tax on the wealth of billionaires, it generates as much revenue as a 5% tax on the income of all people in California. So that is just a very striking illustration of kind of what we were discussing earlier, which is just how massive the wealth of the billionaires has become, and hence its implications for public finance.
Okay, yeah, I've been doing on other stuff, but one of the things in California is it does have high personal income, high personal wealth, but that's a few hundred people that really skew the numbers. So yeah, how's it going? I mean, I know it's I have to say it's a little bit disappointing to see all of the don't be evil guys from Google and all of that scrambling to protect themselves from taxes. But how are you feeling about the
Well,
proposition?
I'm not surprised by that, right? They have good
Yeah,
reasons to hate this because this is the one tax that they would have to pay.
yeah,
You have to realize that they pay very little today. The
right,
billionaires in California, they pay in income tax the equivalent of just 0.2% of their wealth. So,
right,
moving from
right,
0.2% to 5%, even if it's one time, it's a big difference for them.
yeah,
Even though their wealth has increased like 200% over the last 2 years. So from that perspective, it's a drop in the ocean. It's going, I think, the polling is good. It's going to be a battle just because the billionaires are spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions already to stoke fears and try to defeat the proposition in the ballot. But I think the logic, frankly, is so compelling and And also, billionaires are not very popular
Right.
at the moment in California, like everywhere else, that I think it has a good chance to pass. But what I want to say is that, so first of all, it's important for California because there's a big shortfall of federal funding for healthcare as a
Right.
result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so California needs to find broadly 100 billion in revenues to just preserve Medicaid. And so that was the main reason for having this on the ballot in the first place. And so if it doesn't pass, you're going to see the number of uninsured people rise a lot in California. Under business as usual, it's going to increase
Right.
from 6% to 10%. So that's why it's important. But more fundamentally, in my view, it's important because it's the one concrete measure that can begin to make a difference to oligarchic wealth and power. And don't get me wrong, 5% one time is not enough, but this is what's going to pave the way, I think, in my view, for eventually some kind of federal wealth tax and federal annual wealth tax. And the reason why there's good reason to view it like that is because this is what happened for the income tax
Right.
at the beginning of the 20th century, which was first implemented by a number of states, like Wisconsin in 1911, before becoming federal policy in 1913. So yeah, that's why it's really important, and I can tell you that the whole world is watching
Yeah.
California. I think people in France are like, this is amazing. Go California, tax the billionaires, and this is going to be a blueprint for what we'll do in France, in the rest of Europe, and frankly globally.
Well, let's hope. And states as laboratories of anti-oligarchy. Let's hope for the best.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, and forward with the project. Take care.
Thank you so much, Paul.